So it's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to introduce us. Can you guys all see? I got the fan going because I've heard that the last session in here was pretty stuffy. The window is open. So my name is Stephen Mayers, and I'm the co-editor along with Jonathan Freedman here of a collection of oral histories called Solito, Solita, Crossing Borders with Youth Refugees from Central America. And here we also have Soledad Castillo, who's the first narrator of the book. Chapter 1 features Soledad's story. She's from Tegucigalpa. We'll be hearing from her as well. And it's a real pleasure to be here. This is just to say a few words about this book. This is a part of a collection of oral histories by Voice of Witness. How many people have heard of Voice of Witness? Anyone? They're just right down the street. It's a local organization co-founded by Dave Eggers, the local novelist, and Lola Bolin and Mimi Locke, and Dave Eggers also started 826 Valencia. Do you guys know where the pirate shop is over here? 826 is a youth writing program in the back of that, and then across the street is Scholar Match, yet another organization started by Dave Eggers, and in the back of Scholar Match is where Voice of Witness is. Voice of Witness has a book series that this belongs to of oral history collections that focus on human rights, people who have suffered human rights abuses. So it's geared towards amplifying the voices of people who have suffered human rights abuses. I'd say about half the books are about narrators who suffer human rights abuses right here in the U.S. And the other half, roughly, are about narrators who suffer human rights abuses in other countries, often also because of the U.S. And so the other thing Voice of Witness does is it has an educational program. Cliff Mayo, the founder of the educational program, is downstairs at our Voice of Witness table. So we make a curriculum for books and try to get the books in classrooms and form partnerships with educators around the country, a little bit around the world even. So that's a little bit about Voice of Witness. This book came out in April, and we're really happy to be here today. So I'm a City College professor here. I teach English in the English department. And Soledad, who was the first person we interviewed for this book project, and her story ended up becoming the first chapter of the book out of 15. We met right here at City College. And so this book really started here at City College. In my English 1A course, it's focused on migration, and I have my students interview each other and other people who have migrated to the U.S. for their final project. And that's how I got to know Soledad. And I started hearing her story, which is amazing. While she was in my class, I recommended she take a writing workshop with Jonathan Freedman, who Jonathan Freedman, I'll allow him to introduce himself, but he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who gives his time to volunteer at our English lab on the Ocean campus. And he has a workshop this semester it's on Fridays, right? Rochelle's in the workshop. And he does a writing workshop that Soledad joined as well, and anyone's welcome to join as well. So just to introduce us a little bit, Soledad is now a graduate of SF State, and she had both bad and good experiences in the foster care system in California, and is now working for an organization that finds housing for young people, including people out of foster care. So that's a little bit about the incredible work Soledad's doing, which we'll hear a lot of today. So do you want to make a couple of introductory remarks, and then we'll do some reading?
Bienvenidos. I'm very, very happy to be here. Just wanted to address the fact that this is the Howard Zinn Book Festival, and he really was one of the first historians to look at history from the people up. And history is often written from the kings and queens and emperors down. And our book, Solito, Solita, which is part of this oral history series, is not about the people who make history, it's about the people who endure it. So I think it's really important to hear the voices of individual people who are living the human rights crises of our time. This particular crisis is the human rights crisis of refugees, particularly young people coming from Central America. And You've all heard about the political ramifications and the Trump and the border. We will all come to our border in a little while, but we're a very narcissistic country. We think of ourselves as the most important, and our border is the only border that people cross. But in the year 2014, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
there was it came to our attention that there was a huge number of young people, ages 9, 14, 18, coming alone, unaccompanied, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, and from Honduras, and crossing Mexico, crossing borders into Mexico and crossing Mexico, and then reaching our border and coming in. And Stephen and I, Stephen had been thinking about this project before inviting me to be part of it, but why were children coming? Why were they coming alone? And what happened to them on the journey? What happened to make them come? What happened on the journey? And what happened to them crossing the borders and since? So that was our project in 2014 when this was not a highly politicized issue the way it has been since the unnameable president. What I want to say is that I think it's best to start with a person who can really tell about this herself. Stephen and I have many perspectives, etc. But would you like to read from the introduction first?
Yeah. Well, let's introduce Soledad first, and then have her say a few words, and then we want to read a couple of an excerpt from the foreword, which was written by Javier Zamora, a poet who crossed from El Salvador when he was 9. It's an incredible story. We'll talk about a little bit as well. Who was part of this project. So Soledad, we'll talk about your life story, what you're doing now, but let's start with what you're doing now, and also what you want to be doing in the next 5 years. You just graduated from SF State after graduating from City College. So tell us what was your major in SF State, and what are you doing? Well, actually, what have you been doing since? Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Soledad Castillo. Thank you for being here. I graduated last year from San Francisco State. I major in liberal studies and criminal justice. Since I graduated, I got a job at the church department, San Francisco County Jails, helping families to reunite with their children. And now I'm working with a nonprofit called First Place for Youth. I help homeless youth and foster youth in San Francisco to find housing, employment, and help them with education. My plans for the future is to apply for graduate school and get my master in social work so I can keep helping my community.
Yeah, excellent. And she's so excellent for that job because she's personally faced a separation from her family, and she works with the immigrant community as well as just the local community in general. It does very important work. I'm incredibly proud of Soledad and honored to work with her. So maybe, this book has 15 stories in it, and hopefully Gabriel's going to come, who's also from Honduras. He's supposed to be here, but he might be lost or parking or something like that. Hopefully he'll join us and also share his story. Soledad and Gabriel, out of the 15 narrators, are really the main two who have been doing events with us. A lot of people were happy to share their stories in the book, but didn't necessarily want to come out and speak a lot. Also, we interviewed people around the country, and we also interviewed people throughout Mexico at a lot of Casa Migrantes, these like migrant shelters. And many of whom didn't have cell phones or any sort of way to stay in contact. So Soledad and Gabriel are both local, and they've been doing a lot of events with us. So it was hard to kind of narrow this really complex story that involves 3 countries that people are fleeing, as well as the U.S., into 15 stories and keep it under 100,000 words. We managed to convince them to give us an extra 2,000 words, but that's about all we could convince them. So we wanted to cover stories from these 3 countries, right, the Northern Triangle of Central America. We wanted to cover males, females. We wanted to cover the LGBT migrants who are coming up from Central America. We wanted to cover, obviously, people fleeing the maras and the gang violence. We wanted to cover indigenous voices because a lot of people from Guatemala in particular are coming up from, for example, the San Marcos region and facing that. So it was very challenging to sort of pack all the stories in here. But we've done our best to sort of provide a general kind of snapshot of this very complex moment in time, you know. And I wanted to start off by reading a little bit from Javier Zamora. Has anyone read any of Javier's poems? Yeah?
I just read a little bit from Poetry for the People class with Professor Lauren Muller.
Oh yeah, Lauren Muller teaches her poems? That's great. Lauren Muller is excellent. If you ever get a chance to take Poetry for the People here at City College, I highly recommend it. With Lauren Muller is wonderful. Do you remember what the poem was? Probably not. Yeah.
She just had a little excerpt.
He has a beautiful book called Unaccompanied that I highly recommend on Coffee House Press. Javier came up here when he was 9 years old. His parents had moved to San Rafael in the North Bay and had to leave their child behind. I think he was probably like 3 or 4 when they left, you know. And that, just that moment in his life and in a lot of these people's lives, can you imagine leaving your 3 or 4-year-old child somewhere, you know? I think that was one of the main questions we were after in hearing stories, is like, what forces people to do this? Because, of course, no parents would ever leave their child unless they really, really had to, right? Or suggest to their children that they leave themselves, you know, and go on without them onto an incredibly dangerous journey through Mexico, you know, gang-ridden territory on tops of freight trains. So the circumstances from which people flee are really, really dire, you know. And in the case of Javier Zamora, his neighborhood in San Salvador was taken over by the MS-13 gang, and he had to leave, you know. His parents hired a coyote who abandoned him in southern Mexico when he was 9. And he crossed through Mexico twice because he got deported once, or sent back anyway from the border, and crossed at 9 years old twice through Mexico, and finally made it up here. And since then, he went to school in the North Bay, met a poet named Rebecca Faust who sort of took him in as kind of a mentor, went to UC Berkeley, got an MFA in NYU, and then got a Stegner Fellowship at Stanford, a very prestigious creative writing program, and is now teaching, had just finished, I think he's still teaching at Harvard as well. He just spent 2 years teaching at Harvard. And he's like in his 20s, and he's a really pretty incredible person. Yeah, right? Yeah. And I have to thank my wife, Jennifer Arcuni, who's here, who introduced us, because she went to go see him at a reading. So if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have met him either. We're really happy that Javier wrote a foreword for this book. We think it's very powerful. He's a great writer, but he's also lived the exact same stories that we're sort of showing here. Maybe I'll read a paragraph or two. I was born in El Salvador and migrated unaccompanied to California when I was 9 years old. My dad had left me when I was 1, my mom when I was 4. Both of their migrations were initiated by the U.S.-funded Civil War. Their stories, the story of my family, are not unique. A fifth of my country's population fled between 1980 and 1992. Thousands continue to risk their lives every year. El Salvador is Guatemala, is Honduras, is the 258 million immigrants around the world. For the migrant writer, writes Danticat, Edward Danticat from Haiti, far from home, memory becomes an even deeper abyss. Albert Camus says, he quotes, the sea, the rain, necessity, desire, the struggle against death, these are the things that unite us all. We resemble one another in what we see together, in what we suffer together, end quote. What we suffer together. I always return to that phrase. I believe I started writing because I wanted to expel the suffering inside me. Later, I wanted the reader to suffer with me. Not the present day me, but the 9-year-old that follows me like a shadow. I wanted others to feel what I had felt so that they could understand me, so that they could fully see me for who I am, a human being with all his complications. You want to read the next paragraph?
Yeah, I want to just skip a little bit. All of the stories and mine, he writes, share a similar creation myth. Yet we are much more than refugees, much more than child migrants, than people who have experienced trauma. While reading, please do not forget that outside these testimonies there is also joy. There are moments of love, of laughter. Every time we retell a story, we fish into the abyss and pull them out. Here the poet is speaking. The fish is constantly changing the water as well. Both the fish and the water will never go away, but we can envision a better future for our trauma. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be seen in our entire humanity and not how the media paints us. We are not defined by our suffering. So this is an extraordinary evocation of what oral history does. There are 15 stories in this book. Each one of these stories, it took us 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer, to interview people to collect the stories. But as Voice of Witness encourages or demands, the stories are all told in their words. As editors, our job was to interview them and to then rearrange the telling of the story using their words into a format that begins at the beginning, where people come from, and leads all the way through to where they are at the time the book is published. And imagine that. Imagine people who are only 22, 18, 16, 24, who have gone through so much, being asked to tell their story, to open up to strangers, and to be courageous. These stories are difficult, but as Javier says, there is love, there is courage, there is the indomitable human spirit in them. So, can we go back to you now?
Sure.
All right, so bring us back into your earliest experiences as a child.
Yeah. As I want to mention, as you say, it's not easy. It wasn't easy for me to share my story. In our family, we don't tend to tell our private life to other people, so definitely was something hard, but I felt the necessity to share more about the reasons of why many undocumented people immigrate to the U.S. I was born in Honduras, in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. My parents got divorced when I was born. I grew up with my mom, my other 5 sisters, and my stepfather. My dad left to the U.S. when I was 5, my biological dad. Growing with a father was hard because we didn't have that many help from him. We were the poorest family in the community, eating salt and tortilla for months. But my grandmother always taught me to be grateful for what I had. So I was a happy kid with her. She taught me how to love, how to respect others, and how to be thankful for everything. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away when I was 10. That was hard for me because she was everything to me. She was the one who actually took care of me. My stepfather, for some reason, never liked me. So when my grandmother passed away, he sexually abused me. I told my mom, but she didn't believe me. I was only 10 years old, and I had to leave the house. I was the one who had to leave the house, not my stepfather. My mom sent me to work in the city. I was a housekeeper, taking care of children and washing laundry in order to get a food to play. While I was working in the city, I got sick. I was taken to the hospital, and they diagnosed me with lupus. I was in the hospital for a year, taking 15 pills a day, a year. I lost my hair, I couldn't eat, I was in bed. The doctors told my family that I only had a few weeks left. By that point, I was in so much pain that all that I prayed for was to die. Because I was in so much pain, I didn't have anything left. I didn't have any motivation to be alive. After a year of being diagnosed with lupus, they took me to a different hospital, and they did some tests, and they found out that I didn't have lupus, that they misplaced my file with another patient.
Oh my gosh.
I stopped taking the pills, and my hair started growing, but my skin still got damaged because of so many medications. By that time, I asked my dad to come back to Honduras to bring me to the U.S. Coming to the U.S. wasn't an easy decision. We often tend to think that why a lot of people are coming, but we don't ask like why. I didn't have anything left there. I have my sisters, my brother, but I didn't have the support from my mom, from my father, from my other family around. They didn't believe me. My grandmother passed away. Leaving my sisters and my brother wasn't easy, but I wanted to start over and start a new life. God, I feel that it was a miracle that I'm alive, and I feel that God gave me a second chance. But coming to the U.S. wasn't easy either, crossing the borders, where I had to walk for days, like without eating, without drinking water. So can you imagine all those people who are coming to the U.S. for the things that they had to go through in the desert, and they still made the decision to come. So coming to the U.S. is not a choice; it's a necessity in order to survive. And when you arrive in the U.S., the struggle doesn't end there. I have to start from the beginning, learning a new language, learning a new community, learning a new norms. Everything was so different, and I was scared. After I arrived to the U.S. a year later, my dad decided to go back to Honduras. I entered in the foster care system, and I was mistreated for 6 months. I wasn't eating right. I ended up at the hospital more than 6 times.
What happened? Why were you being mistreated? Tell us.
When I arrived to the U.S., for many people, Central Americans, you come to the U.S. to work. You don't go to school. So I was working back and forth, going to asking friends if they would give me a place to sleep. I was like that for 2 years. After I was able to get this studio next to City College, and my grades went up, and I started doing good in school, and I graduated in 2016 with honors from City College. It took me 4 years to learn, because at City College I had to take ESL classes from the beginning, and to get to the regular classes from the other students, to catch up the other students, it took me almost 5 years.
Yeah, really impressive. And I think didn't you get off work at Safeway at 2 in the morning and walk over the hill from Castro to Ocean?
To Ocean,
at 2 in the morning or something like that?
2 in the morning for 40 minutes, walking.
Yeah, you worked hard. You worked really hard.
The struggle doesn't end for you, for the people choose to arrive to the U.S. There's so many more than that. It's so hard to survive here too. It's really hard. If you don't have family, for me, that I don't have that much family support, that I don't have my parents, so it's been really hard. And yeah, I'm so thankful that I'm here, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all.
Yeah, and now you've been back to visit your family, where your cousin, is working at a shopping mall making $2 a day. That's like the full day salary. yet groceries are comparable to what you might spend here, right? And yeah, that's what's it
just-
like? What was it like going back to Honduras?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I went to Honduras to visit my father because he's sick. 2 months ago. The conditions over there are horrible. Like you see the TV, but when you're in person, it's different. You cannot go out in the street because you don't know if you're gonna come back. The gangs violence is out of control, and the poverty. There's people don't have jobs. There's no jobs. Students graduate from college, from university, and they don't have jobs. There's no jobs there, and it's just if you turn the TV on, like every 10 minutes you're gonna see that someone has died, that someone has been killed, and the food is expensive. As Jonathan said, my cousin work in the mall. She gets $2 a day, and I went to help my mom to get groceries, and I paid for the groceries. It was $200. Like how people. Can you just imagine how people survive there? And it's actually when you go in person when you actually see what's going on.
I'd like to just give a little perspective here. How did this happen? What happened to the countries that people left? They weren't just invented yesterday as poor disaster areas. Our president, and we'll get back to the border with you when we visit the border, but just to give a little background, our president said we are being invaded by drug addicts,
Etc.
etc. I don't even want to repeat it. Well, I'm old enough to know because I was a journalist back in the 1980s, and I covered Central America, civil wars going on there. The United States invaded Central America. This was part of what was viewed at that time in our government as a global conflict with communism, with Soviet Union communism. And the way the government decided to fight communism was in our backyard, as if this was our backyard, and this weren't cultures that had completely different histories going back thousands of years, etc. So in Guatemala, there had been a native, the native peoples, the Maya peoples, had been decimated by the Spanish conquista, and there were still, even in the 1950s and 60s, there were terrible oligarchies of very few wealthy plantation owners who owned everything, and there was terrible, terrible racism against the Maya people. So the United States put the mask of the Cold War onto this struggle and trained the Guatemalan military in torture. I remember traveling with the United States Senator to Guatemala in 1983, I think it was then, and we visited a military base, a Guatemalan military base that had been basically trained by the CIA. And they showed this senator, who was a good person, these homemade armaments, not bows and arrows, but like zip guns and things that people had made to try to protect themselves from the landowners. And they told him that this was the communists and the Maoists from China were arming the native peoples of Guatemala, and the United States had to support freedom, liberty, and democracy. In El Salvador, there was a civil war going on. The Bishop of San Salvador had been murdered, and there was a rebellion going on against the 7 or 8 or 12 families that owned El Salvador. So once again, the United States was sending arms and training to the tune of what you were saying, $1 million a day?
I think at one point they were arming the Salvadoran military with $1 million a day while they were committing the worst massacres of Latin American history, like El Mozote. Right.
So, in this case, we're talking about gangs, right? In this case, the children in El Salvador who grew up in the midst of these atrocities, massacres and things like that, committed by both sides, on all sides, their families fled and were given permission to come to the United States because they were anti-communist. But they were dropped in the worst neighborhoods of places like Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, there was already terrible gang violence going on between native gangs there. And so these kids who'd grown up essentially in a genocidal type situation found themselves in the most dangerous place. So they created their gangs. Now the two gangs that we're always hearing in the news about are the MS-13 and the 18. Well, 18 is there's 18th Street in Los Angeles. So these gangs were formed in the United States in the context of survival fighting, and they were committing terrible atrocities. And then the United States, in all our wisdom, deports these young people back to their native countries. At the same time that the Colombian drug lords are beginning to funnel cocaine and other drugs through Central America to the United States. So I just wanted to say that when you're talking about your family and the social breakdown and the violence and the gangs, this is blowback from our interventions in those cultures. And so this is a problem that spans our borders. And Stephen will continue with this, but we believe that the stories of people who are trying to survive and the refugees who are coming here people have to understand the deeper context of why this is happening.
Yeah, thanks for the historical context, Jonathan. Yeah, I think that it's very important to understand that most Central Americans, as well as most migrants coming to the United States, are fleeing us in their countries, that the U.S. has gone into their countries, made life in many ways unlivable, and people are fleeing us, ironically, to us. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, and I don't think that's an exaggeration either, Teaching here at City College, where probably 70% of my students have migrated here, it's like a delayed, my student body is kind of like a delayed reaction to U.S. foreign policy, right? Iraqis, Yemeni, Central America, and it's quite interesting. It's like slightly delayed a little bit, like maybe like a war starts and then maybe a year later I start seeing people fleeing or something like that, and it's so it's very important to put that into context. And like Jonathan said, our refugee policy put into place in 1980 under Jimmy Carter, right, the 1980 Refugee Act, which allows people to apply for asylum if they can prove that they have well-founded fear of political persecution or social persecution, right, or running from a particular social group. It's always been administered in a very sort of Cold War way as well. We like to rescue people from communism, right? And because the Salvadorans were fleeing, for example, a right-wing dictatorship, when at the same time the Nicaraguans were fleeing more from what the U.S. would call socialism. It was socialism, but not like communism. And even if it was, a lot of Salvadorans were left without a chance to apply for asylum, and a chance to become legal citizens in the country. And that's why people form gangs, right? The MS-13 started just like any other street gang, and they were just getting started in the U.S. when we deported the gang leaders back to war-torn Central America, where of course they took over, right? So it's important to realize that MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang are really American gangs, which we've deported to Central America, and they're also using our guns, right? That we ship guns to these countries and heavily arm people in Central America as well as the rest of the world. and then our current leaders act like they're surprised when there's violence that people are fleeing from, when we're actually heavily arming them the same time. And of course then there's the drug cartels, right? So it's a complicated story, but it's definitely a story in which the U.S. is the protagonist and has been kind of all along, right? From the United Fruit Company, which has taken like all the best land throughout Central America, that really, although I think the Salvadoran and the Nicaraguan wars were, in fact, civil wars, which the U.S. played terrible roles in. I think the Guatemalan Civil War, so-called Civil War, was really started by the U.S., right? When we go to protect the so-called corporations' rights to like their land, and then the Dulles brothers, right? One of whom is the United Fruit Company's lawyer, and the other one is in charge of the CIA. Start a war and killing indigenous people for the so-called right of these private corporations to take land from people, So it's sort of to put it all into context, And now, of course, the drug trade brings a lot of money to the wrong people, right? And the president of Honduras, his brother, was just convicted of being a big-time drug trafficker. And Orlando is also, for sure, the president of Honduras, is definitely in on it, So the corruption is very complicated and deeply, deeply connected to the U.S., right? And as you guys all know, right, the corruption is this human problem that we face that's like a cancer and kind of tends to seep into all the little nooks and crannies of society. So we're forced to kind of, apply radiation or chemotherapy, trying not to kill the overall body and ourselves while we try to weed out the corruption. It's a very, very difficult thing. Mostly, we've been trying to. The U.S. has been trying to arm the super corrupt military to go against the drug cartels throughout Mexico. You guys probably just heard that Trump, I think last week, declared that the drug cartels are terrorists, which scared the hell out of me, of course, because we just start this war in which we'll never win, right? Because it's kind of an unwinnable war, and then the people die in the crossfire, right? So just to sort of provide a little bit of context when people are talking about the Central Americans invading, right? For example, maybe we could share a few stories a little bit.
That's great.
Yeah, and then also get back to Soledad, of course, as well.
I just want to say one irony that I wanted to share, which is all my life, growing up in the 50s, etc., it was all about the Soviet Union threatening us. And we had to do these terrible wars in Vietnam and Central America, etc., and all the blowback from it. And we're talking about corruption. Where has corruption come into the United States election? Where does it come from? Where did it come from, the election, the last election? It came from Russia.
Oh, no.
It did. Russia interfered in our election.
Yeah.
Our nuclear weapons didn't protect us, and it came through cyber warfare. So right now we are facing the opposite. We thought we solved the Cold War, that the United States was going to be promoting democracy and defending democracy here, but in fact our own democracy has been threatened. And how is one of the main ways that our president is gaining support? By saying that these people coming from Central America are invading our country. Isn't that ironic? Does anyone else see the irony of that? Anyway, that's my personal.
That's a grand irony. I just want to. I think that the U.S. media and other U.S. forces really played a larger role in the corruption of the last elections, and I think that the mainstream U.S. media is really playing up this Cold War thing. But I do see that irony as well.
Anyway, you're right. Let's get to the story. Why don't you tell one of the stories, Stephen?
All right. Let's share a couple stories. So we met an incredible number of people. We started with Soledad, and right here at City College, and then we started. We interviewed young people, right? So the way we gained access to most people, if we didn't already know them, was to go through legal organizations. And in the meantime, we learned a lot about all this amazing work people were doing in places like Centro Legal de la Raza over in Oakland, across from the Fruitvale BART station, which, by the way, is always looking for all volunteers if you speak Spanish or if you don't. The East Bay Sanctuary, right across the street from UC Berkeley, runs in a little tiny basement, and they're taking on the Trump administration right now and fighting for the rights of people with temporary protected status and stuff. You know, they're amazing people, also looking for volunteers if you guys are looking to do some volunteer work. And we met all these amazing lawyers and people running these organizations and supporting migrants by offering pro bono legal services, you know, and without the government support, of course, you know, and just running on kind of shoestring budgets. And the second person we interviewed was a guy named Adrian Cruz. So maybe we could start there too, because he's from Guatemala City. He was not one of the indigenous Maya people we interviewed, but he was from Guatemala City. He was stuck in a detention center in Richmond that used to be run out of the Richmond jail, right? Which you guys probably know about, right? And an organization that used to be called Civic, which is now called Freedom for Immigrants. Do you know about them? Yeah, they do excellent work, and they basically, the main work they do is just to get volunteers to visit refugees in detention centers, just to visit them, you know, because people are like stuck there and don't have anyone to talk to. So this retired ESL professor was visiting this guy named Adrian, and learned that Adrian, when he was 5 years old, had witnessed his mother being murdered. She ran a little store in Guatemala City, and the gangs came in and demanded rent, which is what they do, right? She couldn't pay it, so they ended her life in front of him when he was 5 years old.
Rent is protection money, it's not rent.
Right, yeah, thank you, yeah, for the footnote, yeah. The mafioso kind of rent. And so then he grew up with his grandparents, as many people do. And when he was, I believe, 13 or 14, the gangs were trying to get him to join the gang. And he was refusing, and they tried to murder him. They shot at him, and they also cut him open from like here to here, and left him in the streets to die. Miraculously, he survived. As he tells it, some firemen were driving by and picked him up and took him to the hospital, and he survived, and then came to the U.S. So he came here as a youth. He crossed the border when he was about 14, I believe, and he was put in foster, kind of a youth home, not foster care, but like a youth home. He was about to be transferred on his 18th birthday from a youth home up near Vacaville to the Huckleberry House here in San Francisco, where you could live and work. You guys know about that house there? Yeah, and so he's really happy because he's about to basically get freedom and live in this house where he could go to school, he could work. But somehow they put him in prison that day. And he describes his 18th birthday as like, yeah, so I was about to go to the Huckleberry House, and they picked me up and said something happened, and now I'm in Richmond prison. And when you're an adult suddenly in the system, it's a lot different from being under 18. When you're under 18, there's certain protections, mostly this ability for lawyers to apply for what's called special juvenile immigrant status, and this was no longer offered to him. So he was in the detention center and couldn't go back to Guatemala because he would have been killed, right? Like immediately he felt. And yet, in order to get out of the detention center, he would need two things. A bond of about $2,000, which is now more than $2,000, but at that time it was about $2,000, and some sort of a sponsor family, because he knew no one in the U.S. He didn't have any family here. So the ESL teacher that was visiting him thought, okay, well, if I can find you a family to be your sponsor family and get $2,000 together, I could get you out of here, right? So just because of the goodness of his heart, he did that, and he found a Guatemalan family, happened to be Guatemalan, wouldn't have had to be, living in Richmond, who was willing to take him in. Got $2,000 together on a GoFundMe kind of page, like overnight. Actually got like $5,000. So when he got out, he got like brand new clothing and stuff like that too. And there was an outpouring of support for him, and he got out. And it just I tell that story to highlight the fact that if it wasn't for that one ESL teacher working for this tiny organization, he'd still be there right now, right? And a lot of people are just sort of, if they don't have family and $2,000, they're going to make $2,000 in jail, right? It's essentially a jail, you know. They call these places correctional facilities and detention centers, but these are prisons, right? These are prisons where people who are not criminals are put and kept, right? And he would still be there today, like many people are, who face either death in their home countries or prison here, you know. That was Adrian's story. A little bit of Adrian's story. Yeah.
I don't know, are we running out of time?
I think we're good. Yeah, we have
3:45.
Half an hour.
we have a half an hour,
Okay,
and
okay.
it'd be nice to have some time for people to ask questions too. But yeah, we have some time.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that, to bring you back into the room here again. So, after your many things you had overcome, and you had gained your citizenship, and you had never been arrested, and you had put yourself through college, and not only while you were doing that, you were also involved in organizations to help other foster youth. And not only that, you testified in the legislature in Sacramento and at Google headquarters. And you had achieved these great things, and people like Stephen Mayers helped you along the way. And I just wanted to say that at a certain point, we were invited, the book was coming out, or just come out.
No, it's just about to come out, actually.
Just
When it
about
went
to
to the
come out.
border? Yeah.
We were invited to give to speak to a binational conference of a college in San Diego, California, and one in Baja, California, in Mexico. And so, this was at the time when President Nameless had started talking about this caravan of people coming to the U.S. border to invade the country. And the president had sent 5,000 U.S. troops to sit on the border in pup tents, armed, ready for the invasion. Would you take us back? We went, first of all, to San Diego, and then we went back to the border. This is the first time you had returned to the U.S. border. Could you tell us what you saw when we went to Tijuana?
We went with Gabrielle too, just to kind of,
Yeah, we went with
who's,
one other narrator.
yeah, another
So,
narrator.
During those weeks, I'll keep watching the TV and listening about this invasion of people who were coming from, especially from Honduras and El Salvador, especially most from Honduras, and it was a big, like, you know, like the president, like telling, you know, oh, this is a big invasion, we need to do something about it. And that's when we were invited to go to speak to Tijuana about this book. When we got to the borders, there was only like 2 people in the borders, and we saw these helicopters, people dressed like army, and it was like, oh my God, I just thought, oh my God, they think that they're criminals or what. I feel so like sad because they thought that they were waiting for, you know, for these terrorists, like bad people. And no, there were like only 2 people that day in the borders.
Yeah, we went to the beach, right?
The beach, yeah.
The extreme southwest
Yeah.
border.
Where the
of
wall
United
goes into the
States and
water, you know.
Mexico.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I remember it looked like the U.S. was invading Mexico, really. I mean, because there was like 2 people on the beach, and it was right when they were putting like tons of barbed
Tons
or
of
concertina
barbed.
wire up, and then they had these like Desert Storm like soldiers on the beach, and there was like 2 people on the other beach, on the side of the beach. It was in order to make that story sound the opposite, like the news did, you would really have to use some very tricky camera angles to get it to look, because to me it looked like an invasion of Mexico for sure, you know.
Yeah.
And then we went to well,
To
yeah, and I want to hear your impressions of the baseball field. But basically, the reason why no one is on the beach too is because some Hondurans had been there peacefully, like sleeping and stuff. And a lot of the neighbors of this fairly rich neighborhood called Las Playas, which is right there, came by and with these like pieces of paper saying, sorry, this is a letter that we've written collectively as neighbors, and you're not allowed to be here. We want you out of here. This is our beach, basically, you know. Which of course it's not. It's like public beach, you know. And then there was some arguing, and then the neighbors were throwing rocks at the poor refugees who had just like gotten here after crossing 3,000 miles. And after that, the police were just picking people up off the beach and bringing them to this like little makeshift refugee camp at this baseball field, right?
Yeah.
The Benito Juarez baseball field, right?
Yeah.
What was it like there? Then we took a cab over there, right?
It was really sad. A lot of people were tired without eating, without, drinking water for days. They've been there for days waiting to hear about their cases. And I felt frustrated, frustrated because there's so like one step close to achieve, to have a better life. Can you just imagine for how big is the necessity for them to walk miles and bring their children, carry their children in their hands in order to have a better future? As I said at the beginning, fleeing violence, fleeing poverty, coming to the U.S. is not an option, it's a necessity to survive. And it was really, I felt hopeless. I felt that I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. People were crying because they were hungry. It was just a lot of people that I wanted to, that was me years ago. That was me years ago, and I couldn't do anything for them. And I just felt mad inside because we talk about immigration more as a political topic, but at the end of the day, we're just humans, and we need to see more of that in people.
I remember seeing children. When you see small children hungry, it's just awful. You know what I mean? You just want to feed them immediately. You know, and we've interviewed people on the border a few times, and we do fill our backpacks with food and water, but it just goes very quickly. You know, you sort of like it just goes in about 5 minutes. You know, there's just so many people. You know, and we've even given money to people a little bit, but we don't. You know, we don't have funding to like fund everyone, obviously. And even if we did, that wouldn't solve the problem either. You know, I mean, there's so much beyond that. But there is this feeling of impotence, right, in the face of it all. It's really, really awful. And I think about people like Soledad and the people, who were crossing, during the Obama administration. And at least if you made it here and applied for asylum, you might have a fair trial. You know, I met a young woman from San Salvador in southern Mexico in Tenosique, which is the location of a migrant shelter called La 72, the 72. That was named after the 72 mostly Central American young people who were massacred by the La 72, Los Zetas, thank you, in northern Mexico, right? Yeah, even though this is in southern Mexico, they named the shelter after that massacre, right? And I met this woman who was traveling with 3 children, a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. Her boyfriend had joined the MS-13 in San Salvador and was starting to like take drugs and like beat her a lot. And he also always kept one of the 3 children with him somehow, so that because he knew that she wouldn't leave unless she had all 3 children. You know, and she talks about that. And it was getting really bad, and she was like thinking about leaving because she realized like if this keeps getting worse, I'm gonna die. You know, he's gonna like kill me. You know, basically. And one day, one of the 3 children was with her boyfriend, not even boyfriend at that point. I mean, he's basically just like, is a hostage kind of a situation at that point. One of the children was with his aunt, and she dropped him off early, and she had all 3 children without him, and she took off. You know, and she came. And the coyote that her parents in Texas had hired and had borrowed money to hire because they didn't have much money, abandoned her, just like Javier Zamora and just like a lot of people abandoned her in southern Mexico. You know, took all the money and just left. You know, and then she was like stuck at the shelter when I met her. You know, and I started talking to her father, both her parents, her mother and father in Texas quite a bit on the phone, and they had a plan. They had some friends in Veracruz, about halfway up the east coast, the Gulf Coast of Mexico, who were going to pick her up, and then she was going to work there for a while, and then she was going to come to the border. And I even talked to some lawyers to get a little bit of advice, and they told me, yeah, she should come to the border and apply for asylum, not try to cross, but just like show up at a port of entry and say, I'd like asylum, please. Because her boyfriend had actually emailed death threats to her, and they had like written threats and stuff like that, and her parents. And we devised a plan where we said, okay, well, you can't tell them about your parents who have been here undocumented for over 10 years, because they could be deported. But you have to have someone an adult to come take you in, and we organized a priest who would play that role. And then we crossed our fingers and said, I don't know if this is going to work, but that's our advice, And then she went into custody, and they took her cell phone, and right then her father stopped answering the phone for 3 days. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Have I endangered him? I was freaking out for like 3 days. And then I called him on the third day. He answered the phone. I said, oh my God, are you okay? And he's like, oh yeah, I couldn't pay my phone bill, but I got my phone back on. And I said, yeah, what about Danelia? Have you heard from her? And he said, oh yeah, she's sitting right here with the 3 children. And it actually had worked. Even under Obama, some people would like end up in the detention center for 2 years. And others would somehow make it through. Like, very chaotic,
Yeah, very.
But I think about her now, and if she had arrived at the border to apply for asylum, and she has an excellent case, that fits the definition of asylum perfectly, of course, she would have been told, oh, did you apply for asylum in Mexico, where she has 0% chance of getting it? Or did you apply for asylum in Guatemala? Because if you didn't, you're not welcome to apply for asylum here, right? Because these are so-called safe third countries, which are not safe at all, and there's like no way she could have gotten asylum there. And if she had applied for asylum in one of those countries in Mexico, then she would have been told to wait in Mexico with no money, where all the shelters are like full, probably living on the streets, with thousands and thousands of people who are like backlogged in Tijuana now, and just waited there with their 3 children on the streets in very, very dangerous conditions. And then, they basically, when we visited there, right, they let like 15 to 20 people in per day to apply for asylum, but there's like thousands of people waiting. And they have no system, right? So I don't know if you guys heard about this, but like migrants themselves have this notebook. If you go to El Chaparral at 6 in the morning, which is a port of entry, it's one of the 2 ports of entry in Tijuana. You can just walk there from San Diego. And if you go there at 6 in the morning, you'll see all the migrants gathering with a notebook. And no one knows where the notebook, who started it, but the migrants take it upon themselves to organize and to write down, basically to make a list, so that they can very fairly bring the next 15 people in. But it takes, once your name's on the list, it takes, months to even get called, and you have to be there every morning at 6 in the morning so you don't lose your spot, which is very difficult for people. So it's just a mess down there. Yeah.
So, we've been sharing a lot of negative things with you, and as I look at your faces, I can tell you're feeling it. Let's talk just briefly about hope. First of all that negative stuff that the arms, the military that we invaded Central America, there are, and all that's come back. Each one of these stories in this book involves a one-on-one contact with someone who offered a hand to help. Not all these stories end up as success stories. One of the young people that Stephen interviewed is now dead, died in the streets.
Opioid epidemic.
Opioid
Yeah.
Victim. But when we think about, I don't want people just leaving this tale of woe, not realizing that one-on-one encounters, supporting groups that are involved. There are so many Americans across the country who are vitally involved in helping. And all solutions for Central America's poverty, etc., should not come from the United States. Often when we come to help, the money, as you probably are aware, gets funneled into governments that are themselves corrupt. But there are many non-governmental agencies, family planning clinics and things like that in Central America that are providing help to people. And from here, we should realize that the threats that are the deputization of the ICE. ICE is now the largest and first national police force in the United States.
In the world. You mean the Department of Homeland Security is the largest police force in the world, right, as well?
But I'm talking about ICE is the largest and the first really national police force. The FBI is not a police force.
Right.
ICE is a police force. They can arrest any one of us on the street, or at least ask for our identification papers. And the borders are no longer on our southern border or on our northern border. The borders are anywhere in the United States. So it behooves us to take account that what is happening to those other people, that no one is safe. What can we do about it? I recommend a 4-letter word. Can you guess what it is?
Vote.
Vote. V-O-T-E.
What were you guys thinking? No. L-O-V-E. It's also it's good
But
word.
if you have questions, let's open it up for questions now.
And actually, and just the last thing I want to say too is on that note of hope, in the first page of the appendix section of the book here is a list called 10 Things You Can Do. So if you can't pick up the book today, you could come take a picture of it. And there's organizations to help. Just getting to know your neighbors, and getting to know people around you. These stories are not at all uncommon, unfortunately. They're like extraordinary when you read them, but like if you speak Spanish, or even if you don't and just know some of your neighbors, you'll hear these stories, all afternoon, So, getting to know people, sort of changing the dominant narrative about immigration in this country, right? I'm trying not to get mad at people who are sort of believers of all these myths, this widespread propaganda and mythology, at play, so trying to patiently educate people, and also supporting organizations, and bonding people out, if you have, any money to donate to Raices, for example, that are doing the kind of work of bonding, like the guy Adrian that I was telling you about earlier, it's kind of, this is a one person at a time kind of situation, so if you can help one person, that's a huge thing, I think. So thanks for coming. Let's have an opportunity to ask some questions, please.
I'll go first. My name is Marcos. I'm also a Guatemalan immigrant. I fortunately had a different type of immigration to this country, with my dad being here for 10 years before I came, and I actually have my green card interview next week. So hopefully,
Good for you.
But
Yeah.
my experience was definitely different, and I have a lot of trouble. Because I do have my family was affected by the Civil War in Guatemala, or like what you said, not even the Civil War, but the attack on the United States on indigenous communities. And you mentioned the United Fruit Company. So, I have a very thorough understanding of my country's history, but I don't feel like that's I don't feel like the communities most affected really understand, by design really, and by the the intensity of the traumas, really, all that has happened, and that story gets more complicated the further away we are from it, and at this point that story is almost 70 years old, starting with the coup, specifically in Guatemala with Arbenz.
In the 50s and before that even. Right.
Exactly, and the 44 revolution. You see, we're coming up on 100 years almost of this of events that, have cascaded to the things that are happening right now. And, I guess it's sort of a question and a comment, how can we, as a diaspora of Central Americans, which is different from the diaspora of other, it's a diaspora on its own, how can we, hold the United States government accountable from the inside and mobilize all the Americans, that really care about their communities, because there are so many, to really stop the intervention, to really allow these countries the room they need to heal, and I don't know, it's just something that I would like the room to think about as they leave.
Great question.
And I'm just gonna plug this. I came with flyers. I have a few. I think I'm just gonna leave them at the front of the table if you want to take some pictures. But it's actually basically what you have here, but in film form. Is this film called Eternos Indocumentados. It's gonna be playing at the Filipino Community Center next Wednesday at 6 p.m. and it's from the International Migrants Alliance. That's what we're putting it together. I'm with Anagbayan San Francisco, which is a youth and Filipino students org. I'm with them because, they have an anti-imperialist perspective, and I would like to learn, and they have that, and I think that's something that our community needs. So I'll leave the flyers for people to see.
And you're a City College student too, and with AFT 2121,
Yes,
right?
I am with
yeah,
AFT
yeah.
2121.
I saw you last week.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
thanks
so
for that too.
I guess how can we get those efforts started in a meaningful way? That actually, can put a closure sort of to this painful story that gets relived generation by generation for 3-4 generations now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a big question, and I just like to start the dialogue by saying, it's not too big. A lot of these problems are like, oof, too big, sorry, too complicated, but it's not too big. We have to focus on what we can do as people, and I think we can get through this, it's not going to be easy. And first of all, by recognizing it as an international problem, like we're talking about, that the U.S. is totally complicit in, is a good start, I think, and really, the fact that lies get as much airtime as truth these days, or much more actually, is a big part of the challenge. For example, getting people to believe in human rights when you have a president that doesn't believe in human rights, right? I almost feel like, that was, I thought that, the U.S. sort of stood for human rights on some level, I'm not totally, ignorant, but I thought that there, at least, I know that people do, but I thought the government was kind of behind human rights and democracy in this country. So, sort of, starting that dialogue. Let's hear what you guys think too. What can we do? Yeah.
So yeah, so absolutely respect the works you do. That's awesome. I'm an immigrant from China. What I want to be more critical about is just like, by definition, immigrants cannot vote. We cannot participate. It's very hard for us to participate in the political, like the state political process.
Right.
So it's really, I think it's really important to find out what else the immigrants themselves can do, and not just be a subject.
If they can't vote,
for
for example.
being helped. Yeah, exactly, right? So what can we do to actually do something by our own volition, by our own power, within our own power?
Right.
And I think there's definitely a lot of different things that we can do. So you mentioned the book as things you can do. I guess I'll definitely like look into that. But yeah, that's what I want to talk
Start
about.
stories. Listen to people. Reminds me of Jose, and also I'm speaking of the Filipino community. Reminds me of Jose Antonio Vargas, who I think Fox News called him the most famous undocumented immigrant in the country. He started Define American, an organization. He's still undocumented, right? And he was on the cover of Time magazine with a bunch of DACA recipients. He's been to Congress, and he started an organization called Define American, which is trying to redefine citizenship as participatory citizenship. Like, you should be a citizen if you show up and participate in the democracy. So he's trying to redefine that. He's also trying to change the language around immigration, It just popped into my head as someone who's undocumented. And, I mean, one of the many people who are undocumented and doing a lot, really, I think that, I think this movement needs to be, or actually, is run and needs to be considered run by the immigrants themselves. I feel like I'm a participant in their movement in many ways. You know what I mean? Because they're the ones who are suffering from the policies and things like that. So.
And also, I think just to educate ourselves about the importance of voting, because there's a lot of people who they can vote, but they're not doing it. Just more education about how we can impact, how one vote can impact, the decisions of other people.
I want to congratulate you. You're so well spoken. And young people, it's so important. It's so important for you to participate in your own ways with your vision and your enthusiasm and caring for the next 20, 30, 40 years. My answer to all the violence, all the sexual and physical domination and cruelty, the ideological conflicts and all that, my answer to it is kindness. Kindness is so very important. When you spoke about your grandmother, that was pure kindness and love. And those things are even more enduring than the histories of what happened in 1954 with Arbenz in Guatemala and what happened in the 80s in El Salvador, etc. And so I really think that we should tone down the anger and think about what Stephen was saying, that are the four-letter word, love. And when you read people's stories, it's really hard to hate them. And that's what we set out to do. These are not our stories. These are each individual stories. And please get the book or tell people about the book. We really want to reach a broader audience and for people to share these stories with each other.
And I think that's a good. I think we do need to focus on kindness and love. Also, obviously, there's a place for anger, and it's definitely justified as well. Both, right, Jonathan?
Oh yeah.
I mean, of course. And to answer part of your question was how do we stop the U.S. intervention? And it's corporations as well, of course, right? And then the corporations work with the government, right? And we've just seen a coup in Bolivia, for example, right? And if you read Spanish news or just like Democracy Now or like alternative news, you probably know about this. But if you just read the New York Times and other things like that, it's astounding how it's like not there. They were just killing people in the streets in Bolivia, and it's like not in the news. And it's unbelievable. You just see it over and over again. It's the same history that we were just talking about happening right here in 2019, right? So the level of silencing of this, is just astounding. So getting the word out is huge, but more than that, it's just like this machine. It's like, so all these things are good, but it's very challenging. It's very challenging what we're up against. Please.
What role do the embassies play? The embassies to these countries, what role do they play?
Well, as we saw in the hearings, there's professional diplomats who, in my experience as a foreign correspondent, they were really trying very well to understand. I was a foreign correspondent in Brazil, South America. They were really trying to understand the cultures and provide cultural exchanges and that. But the problem is the military, the U.S. military, the Pentagon, the CIA, etc., and politics are really, many of the interventions were not things that people who knew the countries who were embassy professionals would have recommended. So I would say that there's like the division in our society within the State Department and the embassies. There's that same thing, and I thought it was great in the hearings that you saw professional diplomats standing up for truth.
That was promising. I recommend a book by Haymarket Books as well called The Long Hunter and Night by Dana Frank, a historian at UC Santa Cruz. Great history of Honduras in the last 10 years, including the movements, people hitting the street, under incredible danger, and like the LGBT community, for example, in Honduras hitting the street, and just dedicating their lives to fighting against the corruption, So uniting across borders too, which is more and more possible, I think. Something else we should focus on.
The title of this book comes from Adrian, that boy whose mother was killed, and they tried to kill him. And he kept saying when he was talking to us, Solito, Solito, which means alone, alone. This is alone female, alone male. And I think our ultimate message is from Solito, Solito, alone, alone, to solidarity with refugees from Central America.
So thanks for coming, guys, today. And I think by listening, you're doing a lot just by listening. So it's one of the main things we need to do is be loving listeners. if you guys have any, want to chat or ask any questions, come on up, you know, and,
I'm gonna leave these flyers for people to take, you know, pick. I only have 2, but because we had to print before we came, so I'll leave them at the front table so you can take pictures.
Photograph
But
them.
yeah,
I'll
it's,
take a
it's actually all stories from, you know, Central American refugees